Welcome to the Practical Pastor's Guide to the Parochial Report with your host, Eric Williams, the Practical Pastor. I'm an Episcopal priest. I've been a priest for over 27 years. I've filled out about 25 parochial reports over those years. And in this guide, I want to give you some tips to understanding and filling out the parochial report. This is not an official guide. This is only my personal take and interpretation, very opinionated ideas about the parochial report, but I hope it will be helpful to you as you think through the different steps that you need to take in filling out the parochial report. I'm assuming because you're watching this video that you have been tasked this year with filling out the parochial report, so congratulations, and let's get started. The official title of the parochial report is the Report of Episcopal Congregations and Missions according to Canons 1.6, 1.7, and 1.17. It's a very old continuous gathering of data for the Church. It's overseen by the House of Deputies Committee on the State of the Church, and the Church's Executive Council approves the form that we use every year, a form that I might add has changed over the years as the Church has tried to get a better handle on what data it wants to collect and how to use that data to understand what's happening throughout the Church. We call it a rite of passage, and everyone looks forward with great joy to January and February, the months when we prepare the parochial report. It is due March 1st of each year, and that data is then collected by diocesan offices and forwarded on to the Episcopal Church as a whole. Actually, that's a little untrue. You'll be filing it online, as I'll show you, and it'll go directly to the Episcopal Church, but your diocese keeps track of which congregations have completed the report, and they also fill out a report later in the spring, I think by May 1st. Before we get started in the details of it, I want to say that this is really important work. Good record keeping is important for several reasons. The parochial report gives us a way to measure consistently the life and ministry of our congregation. It helps us to set benchmarks to understand our growth or decline in our budgets and our membership and attendance. And your diocese and the Church as a whole rely on this information for budgeting and ministry planning. Much like the census, it is an important tool that is used in understanding what's going on. It goes, in a way, probably all the way back to William the Conqueror, who, after he had conquered England in 1066, a couple decades later, decided that he really needed a census, a way of getting a handle on the different people and activities, and especially the economic activity of his country. And so he commissioned the Domesday Book, because it was supposed to be the most complete record until the day of doomsday, when our names would be written in the Book of Life. This was an interim step to help him more completely understand the country he had conquered and to get a better handle on how he could raise taxes. Many dioceses, in fact, use the parochial report in their calculation of assessments. We don't call it a tax, but your diocese may call it a fair share pledge or an apportionment or an assessment. This is the money that your congregation pays to support the work of the wider church, of the diocese and the Episcopal Church as a whole. And the only way they know what's going on and how to calculate that number is from the financial information that you provide in the parochial report. So it's very important in that regard as well. And finally, record keeping in congregations has been for centuries an important tool for historians and families, for genealogists to understand the patterns of life. And so your records of baptism and confirmation, of marriage and funerals are incredibly important in that regard as well. So know that this sometimes unfun work of compiling and reporting data is really important in many, many ways. So getting started, as I mentioned, this is an unofficial guide. If you want the official instructions for filling out the parochial report, you can find them on the General Convention website on the link that I have posted here on this slide. And they walk you through all of the details and everything that you'll need. But the reason for this video is that there are still some areas in understanding the language and the terms and the data that are not entirely clear. And so I want to explore those with you a little bit and to give you some tips for compiling the information, which will make your process of filling this report out hopefully a little bit easier. Finally, the parochial report used to be filled out in paper. It's now done online at this website, reports.dfms.org. DFMS, if you're wondering, stands for Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society, which was one of the official titles of the Episcopal Church from way back. To log on to that site, you will need your congregation's unique Episcopal identification number, the UEID, which should be in the file with last year's parochial report and PIN number. If you don't have those or can't find those, your diocesan office should be able to give them to you as well. There are 4 sections in the current iteration of the parochial report. There's a people section, membership, attendance, and services, a money section, stewardship and financial information. The third section is a report on which priests and deacons serve your congregation regularly, if any. And the last section is a newer section that talks about outreach and volunteer activity, a way of measuring how our congregation impacts the community around us. That's, as I said, a newer section, and it's helping in understanding our impact as a church on our communities. So let's start and spend most of our time actually on Section 1, Membership, Attendance, and Services. You'll find that there are different people that normally fill out different sections of the report. You'll want to talk with your congregation's treasurer or bookkeeper or other financial person for Section 2, the money part. There's a lot of technical information which you'll need to compile. And if you are the priest or if you're the parish administrator or the secretary, it's most likely that you'll need their help in filling out Section 2. Section 1, however, is often done by the priest or the warden or the parish administrator or secretary. And so we'll spend most of our time on this section, and then we'll touch on the other sections as well, so you can understand at least what those terms are and what the different sections mean, and hopefully that will help you as well. So what about this idea of membership in the church? This, to me, gets at one of the most controversial and complicated aspects of being an Episcopalian. The way that we track and understand and define membership almost defies comprehension, in my view. And so let's talk through some of the categories that you'll be asked to talk about and report. Currently, for the parochial report, we have So you will need to assemble a lot of information, and I think this can be the most intimidating part of the parochial report. The more planning you do for this, the better off you'll be when it comes time to actually fill out the report. You'll need last year's parochial report, which gives you all the data that you put in last year. You'll need some kind of file from your church's office that tracks the official transfers in or out. There's always paperwork associated with that. There's a paper form. In fact, this is another sort of archaic part of our church, but there's a form sort of in triplicate that gets sent between parishes when someone is transferring. And there's a copy that you keep in your file and a copy that the other parish keeps in theirs, whether you're transferring someone in or out. And so you want to make sure you check that file if you have one, if anyone has done that. I'm suspicious that is not being done very much anymore, that the movement of people between denominations and particularly within the church, Episcopal Church, within parishes, I'm not sure the paperwork is always getting done, so you may not find any files, but check that. Make sure whoever your parish administrator is or your priest, or if you are one of those people, that you know who has actually transferred in or out. Then you'll need the Sunday worship attendance register, which we'll talk about in a second. That's the book where we record attendance for every church service that we hold, every baptism, every marriage, etc. And then there are these other registers, and I'll show you a picture of one that we keep track of: baptisms, confirmations, marriages, and funerals. And you'll need those books as well, which could be stored in my church. They're stored in a file cabinet. They could be on a desk or in a bookcase or somewhere, but you'll need to find all those and see what has been recorded. Sometimes you'll notice that things weren't recorded, and so you can take this opportunity to make sure that things which happened over the year actually get recorded in those books. Then, and this is where I want to share some of my tips, you need some way of finding out the ages and current status of each parishioner. This can be laborious. There are church software programs that you can use which really can help with this. But again, like all processes, they have to be kept up to date. Someone's got to have the job throughout the year of entering people and keeping their emails and addresses and phone numbers and ages, etc., up to date. And you can also use it, and I recommend using that software to keep track of people's parochial report status as well, and measuring and marking when that status changes. I've found over the years that the software isn't enough. We use the biggest company now that does church software is called ACS, and they have a product that a lot of Episcopal churches are using called Realm, which is a cloud-based online version of ACS. And there's a financial part of ACS, and there's also the membership part. But in former churches, I've used Church Windows, and there's a bunch of other programs that people use for tracking this information. I found that in conjunction with a tried and true old-fashioned spreadsheet can really help you in doing this work. If you're not a spreadsheet person, it's tremendously off-putting and boring, but maybe you can find someone in your church who just loves data and spreadsheets and make this their project. Maybe that'll be one of the ways they work for the spread of the kingdom of God, is by doing spreadsheets. And then you'll need to talk with whoever does education in your church, because part of the parochial report involves reporting on child, youth, and adult education programs and the number of people that are typically involved in those. So that's a lot of the information. So let's look at some of these books you'll need. This is typically what a register of church services looks like. It's got lines where you can see each Sunday what the attendance was, how many people took communion. There are also columns for the other categories that you'll need to report on, which are the daily office, morning and evening prayer, or noonday prayer in Compline. That's called the daily office, and you'll count how many times that was done on a weekday or a Sunday. Private Holy Eucharist, so that's often when a Eucharistic visitor or priest or deacon brings communion to a homebound parishioner or someone in the hospital or an assisted living facility. You'll keep track of how many of those were done. You'll keep track of baptisms and marriages and burials, all of those columns. And so at the end of the year, if you've been faithfully filling this out in the correct columns, you just count in all those columns through the year, and you come up with totals that you then plug in to the parochial report. So this book is incredibly important. It's important that it's kept up to date during the year. Sometimes it's easy, particularly if you're a congregation where you have a lot of supply clergy or lots of different people who are managing this. It can be a challenge to keep this book up. And it's, I think, helpful to have somebody who kind of manages that, who's a regular person. If you have different clergy coming in, have a lay person who just makes sure that this book each Sunday is attended to. Maybe it's someone from the altar guild who's there. A lot of times this book is kept in the sacristy, or it could be kept in the church office or the priest's office. But wherever it is and whoever is responsible for it, keeping it up to date throughout the year will save you a lot of headaches when it comes time for the parochial report. And as I mentioned, there's these canonical registers, often separate green books. I don't know why they're green, but in most churches I've been in, they've been these old green ones. I think they used to be published by Morehouse Publishing. I'm not even sure who publishes them now, maybe Church Publishing. But these are registers where we track all the burials and baptisms and marriages and confirmations. And again, it can be a challenge to keep these books up, but the more they're kept up throughout the year, the better off you'll be when it's time to do the parochial report. And the spreadsheet. So this is my trick. This is just one section of this year's spreadsheet that I put together for this year's parochial report. I left off the last names to protect the parishioners, but you'll see I have the names. I have then columns for each of the parochial report categories: baptized member, communicant. And then, this has been really helpful for me, what action, if any, I took on them in each year. So I've been in my congregation a little over 3 years. So what did I do in 2017 when I was filling out the report? What action in 2018? What action in 2019? Who was added? Who was made inactive? Who died? Who was confirmed? Who was baptized? And so forth. And so I can keep track, a running kind of track of when I moved someone from one category to another, because otherwise it can be really confusing to keep track of it. I find it helpful to have this list of everybody that I'm aware of in the congregation, no matter how active or less active they are. I try to keep track of everybody that I know, that I can at least put a face with, and then keep track each year of what's happened with them. And then the yellow columns are what I'm reporting for this year. So for 2019, what is their parochial report status? Are they a baptized member? Are they also an adult communicant in good standing or a youth communicant in good standing? Or are they someone who's an other active? And as I go down the whole list, I'll just put a number 1 in each of the boxes that works for. So they could be a baptized member and a communicant in good standing, obviously. But if they're an others active, that'll be the only box that they're in. And by putting a number 1 in that box, when I go to the bottom, I can just do a sum, and my number magically appears. And that's the way I know what numbers to put in the parochial report. I found that this, in conjunction with our church management software, is a really helpful way of tracking year by year what's happening with the members of the church. And I'll say on a pastoral note as well, that by listing every single person in my church and by thinking about them, it gives me a wonderful opportunity this time of year to pray for every single person in my church, to pray about those who have died or those who are getting active or those who are making a change, becoming an adult, turning 16. It gives me an opportunity to lift them up in prayer. And so you may not think about this, but data crunching and parochial report preparation can be a wonderful opportunity for intercessory prayer. So let's look at the parochial report itself. These are the different boxes, the way they show up on the report. The first thing, when you sign into your online parochial report, you'll see that they automatically show you and put into this box the members that you reported last year. Whoever filled out your report, it'll just magically appear in box M18. And so you know the benchmark that you are working from for this year's report. Then we have the section on baptized members and communicants in good standing. As we talked through, there are some subjective things that you'll need to sort through as you figure out who to put in there. The first thing, number 1, you'll figure out the increases during the year. So during 2019, who were baptized, who were added to the baptized membership, who were confirmed or transferred in, any of those methods of becoming a baptized member, and those persons restored from inactive status. Maybe a few years ago someone left the church or got inactive, and so you move them off of the active membership list, and now they've come back this past year, and so you're restoring them from inactive status. That's an addition. And then there's some that you just forgot to count, or you didn't have good record keeping in the past, and so you've had to catch up the count. And so all those can be in your total increases. There are also decreases. So obviously death is a way of decreasing, transferring to another congregation, or being moved to inactive status. Removed for other reasons, not sure what those would be, or you forgot to remove them last year, and so you're removing them this year. And sometimes there are people you're just not sure about. Are they really inactive or not? People are on journeys in towards the center of a church or out towards the fringes, and so you're sort of capturing a snapshot in the parochial report of where they are in their relationship with the church. Once you take your last year's number and you add up all the increases and you subtract all the decreases, you get your total active baptized members for this year, M19, and you put that in the box. Now, as I mentioned, baptized membership is the larger category, and so now you're going to report your communicants in good standing. These should be, when you combine them, a slightly lower number than your baptized members. But you count the adult communicants in good standing, as I mentioned, 16 and up, and then the youth under 16, and then you get your total communicants in good standing. So if you're doing this right, box number 5 should be slightly lower than box M19. If it's not, you need to go back through and think about how are you measuring people's status. And then finally, that others active section, box number 6, those who didn't quite fit in either the baptized membership, but they're active, you put them in others active. So the next section is attendance and worship services. As I mentioned, this is largely coming from your attendance book, that red book. You'll keep track of all the different services and the attendance at each of them. Once you've added up, for instance, in our church, we have an 8 o'clock and a 10 o'clock service very typically. So you combine the 8 and 10 for each Sunday, and you add them all up for the year, and you get your total attendance, and then you divide by the number of Sundays in the year. This can be tricky. Every once in a while, we get a 53rd Sunday, so you want to make sure you get the right denominator for your fraction there and divide the right number. Most often it's 52. You divide, and you get your average Sunday attendance. This is considered the most important statistic for the church as far as measuring membership, because membership, as we've seen, is very subjective, but average Sunday attendance is a harder number. It's less noisy, according to the statisticians, and so this really helps us see the temperature of the church. Are you growing? Are you shrinking? What's the rate of that change? And it's just a really helpful statistic across the church for seeing how we're doing. Then number 8 was added, I think, a few years ago, because not all Episcopal churches or congregations or whoever's filling out the report, could be a chaplaincy, not all of them have their main service on a Sunday. When I was in seminary, we were all busy on Sundays doing field work, and so our main community Eucharist was on a Tuesday night. Many campus ministries have their main service on a non-Sunday, for example. And so if that is the case, then you don't do number 7, but instead you do number 8, which is your principal worship service attendance if it's on a weekday. So you either do 8 or you do 7. Most places, of course, will do 7, Sunday and Saturday. And I should mention that Saturday evening services count for Sunday. So many churches added a Saturday evening service, sometimes called the Golfer's Mass. So if you have one of those, you count that attendance in your average Sunday attendance. And then number 9, in the old parochial report, we used to count 4 key Sundays to get, a snapshot of how things were going. Now we've reduced that to just Easter Sunday, or I should say more properly, Easter Day, and we keep that attendance as well, often higher than your average Sunday attendance, but you keep that for each year as well. And that also includes the Easter Vigil on Saturday night if you do the Vigil. So make sure you're counting that in the Easter Sunday attendance. And then the other ones from 10 through 16 are those columns in your service register that don't count the number of people, but just the number of services that were held. So the total that you had on Sunday and Saturday evenings throughout the year. For us, it's like 8 and 10 throughout the year. Usually it's around 104. Sometimes there are extra services that pop up, 105, 106, something like that. Weekday Eucharist, some churches do a weekly Eucharist, or you may just have them occasionally, but however many you had goes in line 11. Private Eucharists, those are, as I mentioned, typically the priest or deacon or Eucharistic visitor bringing communion to someone in the hospital, assisted living, or at home. The daily offices on Sunday or Saturday. So many congregations that don't have a full-time seminary-trained priest will have the daily office on Sunday on either a regular or semi-regular basis, often led by a lay worship leader. And so, or you may be a low Episcopal church that loves sung morning prayer on Sundays, and so you count the number of times the daily office is done on a Sunday or Saturday evening, whether or not it's the main service. I know some cathedrals will do morning prayer on Sunday morning and the Eucharist a couple of times. And then daily offices held on weekdays. There's a lovely tradition in cathedrals and some other churches of holding morning and evening prayer daily during the week And so count the number of those that were done. And then marriages and burials. And finally, for this section of the parochial report, education. You'll need to talk to whoever runs Sunday school, if there is one in your church, whoever runs your, and that would include, I believe, youth group. Children and youth is number 22, so you combine your Sunday school and youth group. 23 is a question. Do you hold regular adult education programs? Yes or no? And if you do, what's the total number of adults? Not the average number that comes, but the total number. If you can think about all the people throughout the year who came to adult ed, how many would that be total? And then another question, what languages is worship conducted? English, Spanish, French, or other? We have a group of Brazilians that have been coming, and so we've been toying with the idea of having a Portuguese service. But finding someone to lead that is an interesting challenge. So whatever languages your congregation is leading worship in, report that as well. That is section number 1. If that's all you wanted, you can tune out now, but we're going to walk through the other sections pretty briefly now. So if you'd like to stay tuned, we're going to move on to the money part. So section 2 is stewardship and financial information of the congregation. As I mentioned, very often this section is filled out by your treasurer or bookkeeper or other person who manages money and finance in your congregation. And once again, you'll need to compile all the information that you will need for this section. Often it's your budget and bank account information. The church wants to know several things about your finances, and we'll talk through those different categories. First thing they want to know is pledges. So money principally comes into churches through pledges. People sign pledge cards and make their pledge, or they give other gifts. So the first thing the church wants to know is how many confirmed pledges did you get? However you collect those pledges. How many pledges were made for last year, and what was the total dollar amount that was represented by those pledges? This is not extra gifts or people who give without pledging. This is the pledging only. And then we split our money into operating and non-operating. So you'll have operating and non-operating revenue and operating and non-operating expenses. And the key word is operations. So think about that as you're going through this. The way that money comes in, as I mentioned, the biggest section is plate offerings. That's loose money or checks that come into the plate during the collection without a pledge. And then pledge payments, those regular pledge payments. Sometimes people are encouraging people to do that online and to have it either be debited from their account regularly or automatically. That helps people not get behind. That's what we do in our family. And then other regular support. So number 3 is often the largest section of operating revenue. Then there's money from investments that's used for operations. So I want to highlight this, used for operations. So it's not all your investments. It's just what you took out and used for your operating budget last year. Other operating income, like restricted or unrestricted gifts, contributions from the congregation's organizations, but all of it, you guessed it, used for operations. And finally, any unrestricted bequests that are used for operations. All that is considered operating revenue, and it all gets reported in this section and put in box A. Then some congregations receive assistance from the diocese. I was vicar of a mission church many years ago, and we received, for a while, subsidies from the diocese to help with our operating budget. And so we reported that in this box on the parochial report, or whatever it was called way back in the 1990s. So what is non-operating revenue? That is money which is not used for this year's operation. It can include capital funds, the money that you're saving up for different capital projects, gifts and additions to that. It can be additions to an endowment or other investment funds, again, with money that's not being used in the current year but saved up for later. It could be contributions and grants for congregational-based outreach and mission programs. And this funds for transmittal to other organizations, number 11, is the pass-through, money that's coming in and then immediately going out to other organizations. And expenses are divided in the same way between operating expenses and non-operating. The operating expenses include money that goes to the diocese for your assessment, apportionment, or fair share, whatever your diocese calls that. We track that every year. Outreach from the operating budget, we want to track that. How much of your budget is going toward outreach, and then all other operating expenses, which tends to be the bulk of your budget in line 14. And then non-operating expenses include major improvements and capital expenditures, expenses for outreach and mission, funds. This is interesting, number 17, funds contributed to seminaries. Back a long time ago, General Convention passed a resolution that every congregation in the church be encouraged to give 1% of what was in those days called the NDBI, the net disposable budget income, to the support of seminaries of the Episcopal Church. It's my hunch that that has really diminished over the years, but we still track that and report how much money goes to the support of seminaries. That's separate from money you might give for a seminarian in your church who is attending a seminary. This is just for the ongoing support of the seminaries. And then number 18, the pass-through, funds sent to other organizations. Finally, the parochial report also asks you to report on your balance sheet, all the cash in your checking and savings accounts and all investments at their current market value, so we have a sense of the overall assets of congregations at the end of each year. And now we turn to section 3, a very short section, which asks you to list the priests and deacons that serve in your congregation on a regular basis. We'll look at how they track that and what information you'll need to gather for that. So there are a couple of different categories in this section. First, the priests that serve the congregation, and they want to know first who is the sort of main priest, if you will, the rector, vicar, the dean if it's a cathedral, or priest in charge or interim, their name, the title of their position. You need to know the year they were ordained a priest, which you can get by asking them, or there's an Episcopal Clerical Directory. Some parishes have one on the shelf, and you can look them up and see what year they were ordained. Priest is what they're looking for here. And then every priest in the church has a diocese of canonical residence. May not be your diocese. They may be canonically resident in another diocese, perhaps where they were ordained or served previously. They may be sort of on loan, but every priest has to have a diocese of canonical residence, and it's that bishop who is responsible for them, if you will. So you need to report that. And then the employment status. Are they full-time or part-time or non-stipendiary, a fancy way of saying unpaid? The year they were called to your congregation, and then the pension status, active, retiree, or non-active. And again, you can ask them or the diocesan office if you don't know the answer to those questions. And then if they're perhaps in a multi-parish cluster or in some other arrangement, the names of the other congregations that they're currently serving. Then there's a section for associate clergy, and so you can put as many as you want. I just listed one here, but if you have an associate or an assistant or a curate, they could be retired, they could be paid, they could be unpaid, and again, you're going to list all those same things: their name, their title of their position, the year of ordination, canonical residence, their employment status, pension status, and the year they were called to your congregation. Increasingly, congregations have a variety of different methods to provide for the sacramental life of the church. Some very large parishes might have more than 4 priests who serve the congregation on a regular basis, and so you can online add as many of those as you want. If you're using a paper form, which is unlikely because now everything is online, you can attach a paper to it. And then if you don't have a resident priest, and this is true for a lot of congregations, you might be a total ministry or baptismal ministry congregation. You might have, a whole host of different circumstances, particularly congregations in rural areas may have a variety of long-term supply. So you can check all that apply here: supply priest or deacon, a lay worship leader, a lay vicar, whatever the circumstance of your congregation within the rules of your diocese. And then if you have a long-term supply priest, they want to know the name of that long-term person. Some congregations are fortunate enough to have a deacon serving in the congregation, and there again you need to report who is serving in your church. There are two types of deacons in the church. There are what are called vocational deacons, or they used to be called sometimes permanent deacons. These are people who are called to the diaconate and are ordained to be deacons. And you may have one of those. Or if you're a church that has an assistant clergy person, they may be for a while a transitional deacon, which means they are ordained a deacon first, and then after a certain amount of time, 6 months or a year or sometimes longer, they'll be ordained a priest. And so during that time, they're called a transitional deacon. And so you report both of these types of deacon. If you have one or the other, or sometimes both, report that on the parochial report as well. And now we come to the final section of the parochial report, the outreach ministries and volunteer activity of the congregation. I'll show you the form that they ask you to fill out to think about. And it's worth thinking about with maybe your vestry or other leadership. What are the different ministries that go on in your congregation, and how might you share that information? How many people are served by those? How many volunteers participate regularly? Because you'll need all that for this form. So here are the categories. You can see I've filled in a little section here, but there's just three. There's a whole long list, but I just put the first three on here. You need to indicate whether you don't have that ministry, or if you do, whether you have a few volunteers or many volunteers, and that's subjective. I don't know what the cutoff is between few and many. Like, is 6 many or few? Is 20? And then the estimated number of people served, and again, that can be a little challenging depending on the ministry. Sometimes you'll get a few one week and a lot the next week, and so you have to use your best judgment in filling this out. But this helps the church to see the impact that we're having in our community. So now, congratulations, you're done with your parochial report. Well, almost done. You still need to finalize it and get certifications. You need the clerk of the vestry representing the vestry oversight to sign and date it, the treasurer or financial vestry officer, and that's really important because they are largely responsible for the information in Section 2 about money, and then the rector or vicar or priest in charge, if they haven't been the one filling all this out, they still need to certify it, sign it, and date it with their contact information. And then the vestry approval, and this one can trip you up if you're not careful. If you remember, the due date for the parochial report is March the 1st, and most vestries only meet once a month. So you want to be able to get this done in time for your February vestry meeting, if possible, so that the vestry can read it over and vote to approve it, and then you can submit it and click that submit button online once everything has been done. So that takes a little bit of preparation. Well, congratulations. You've made it through this video. I hope it will be helpful as you go through the parochial report. I know we've raised some more questions perhaps than we've answered, particularly about membership, but I appreciate your attention to this. And for The Practical Pastor, I'm Eric Williams, signing off.